Right, I think we'll get started tonight. I want to welcome everybody to the presentation tonight, and I'm glad you came and joined us. The event tonight is sponsored by Thrive in Hastings. And at Thrive in Hastings, we exist to improve trust and safety for all, expand cultural competency within our community, build bridges so that all feel welcomed. And we do that through a variety of different methods, but some of them are to provide educational opportunities, host community conversations, and support community activism. Thrive is a community initiative that was born out of a community human design thinking process that was conducted after a joint proclamation from our city council and our school board announcing Hastings as a community that would be welcoming to all. To be a part of Thrive, all you need to do is just show up like you did tonight. We've hosted many presentations, community conversations throughout the year, and encourage you to attend, gain new perspective, start conversations in your circles, and be the change that you want to see happen. To get us started tonight, I'm going to introduce Carrie Jager, who is a teacher at Hastings High School, and she will kick it off by introducing our speaker.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to this event called Superheroes for Justice. Dr. Artika Tyner is a passionate educator, author, sought-after speaker, and advocate for justice. At the University of St. Thomas School of Law, Dr. Tyner serves as the founding director of the Center on Race, Leadership, and Social Justice. She is committed to training students to serve as social engineers who create new inroads to justice and freedom. Tyner received her bachelor's degree from Hamline and her master's degree from St. Thomas. Then she began her journey with law because she recognized that the law is the language of power, and therefore she sought to become well-versed in the law. Subsequently, Tyner earned a Master of Public Policy and Leadership and later a doctorate in leadership. Tyner is committed to empowering others to lead with their respective spheres of influence. She provides leadership development and career coaching for young professionals. She has also developed leadership education materials for K-12 students, college and graduate students, faith communities, and nonprofits. Additionally, she teaches leadership coursework on ethics, critical reflection, and organizational development. Her research focuses on diversity, inclusion, community development, and civil rights. She has presented her research and conducted leadership training programs both nationally and internationally. Needless to say, we are thrilled to have Dr. Tyner here with us tonight, focusing on our children and how we can best talk to them about race and racism. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Tyner.
Thank you for that warm welcome. If I summarize who I am, I'm really a daughter of Rondo, of the community here in St. Paul, a historic African-American community that was built upon the principles of racial justice and inclusion. So when I think about who I am, it's really been a passion and a journey of mine to learn about more key strategies for teaching these principles around leadership, around social justice, advocacy, and around racial healing. I encourage you to please include your questions in the chat. I look forward to answering any questions as you're looking for practical strategies or additional information as we go through our learning experience together this evening. So my focus will be, I'm always curious when there's a speaker, how will they organize their presentation? What will I learn? I'll give you a little bit of information about my background and what inspired me to do my work as a civil rights attorney. I'll talk about some of the strategies that we can think about in leading change and anti-racism. And I'll also give us some examples of things that we can teach young people about as it relates to building a more just and inclusive society. So with that, let's join in. So for me, my journey started over 2 decades ago in a classroom as I sought to become the mirror image of one of my favorite teachers, who was my English teacher, Mrs. Haug. So I trained at Hamline to become a high school English teacher. That was the only thing that could possibly make sense for me. However, as I went on the venture into student teaching, I was able to see many of the challenges that students face that went beyond the resources, beyond the talents of teachers, to real societal issues. Whether it was my first experience of addressing homelessness, food insecurity for children, and just overall, many of the challenges that you see at the intersection of race and poverty. That really was a catalyst. It didn't take me away from my dream of becoming a teacher. I teach in the classroom every day, but it helped me to maybe reshape that dream a bit in the sense of becoming Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire. Basically, I wanted to become Wonder Woman with a law degree and an afro. I was determined that if I could use those same talents that I saw Mrs. Hogg use in bringing people together, showing a love for the humanities, for literature, and more importantly, showing us how to serve and be impactful in our community, that of course, that I could live out that dream, not just only in a high school classroom, but I could live out that dream all over the world. So I've had the honor and privilege from the introduction of my TED Talk, traveling across the world and asking the question of what is in your hands to make a difference in the world? And when I think about that specifically, that was the opening of the TED Talk. It's really a challenge for us each and every day. And as we put it squarely in the topic that we're going to talk about tonight, as it relates to addressing racism and promoting racial justice, we know then that the challenge then becomes for each of us. This is not something just for our neighbor or just for someone who may have been impacted. This is for all of us to join in and see how we can make that difference. So specifically, when we think about it, I look at it based upon my research. I'm a leadership scholar. So I'm looking at trends in leadership. And when I'm talking about leadership, I'm talking about our ability to really manifest change in the lives of our students, in the lives of our children, in the lives even of others in the community. So I start off with the question of how do you define inclusive leadership? And notice I put this adjective here as inclusive to make sure that we're thinking strategically if we are facing, and let me just do a little backdrop of this for you all. As we think about race in particular, we know that there are many challenges that we face in America. In particular, let me bring it home to the Twin Cities. When we look at racial disparities, we have racial disparities in Minnesota in every quality of life indicator. In fact, I was just lecturing on this. Oftentimes, Minnesota is characterized as a tale of two cities because truly, Minnesota is named one of the #1 places to live. I didn't even know we're named one of the happiest places to live. And more importantly, overall, we have a high level of philanthropic engagement, a high number of Fortune 500 companies headquartered here. So that leads to our economic development. And so those were the statistics about Minnesota that I knew. Unfortunately, NPR did a special to give us a sense of what are the realities that are experienced by people of color, in particular African Americans. And we see a bit of a different story. Now, a part of this could be a myriad of different issues with contributing factors. That's a separate lecture. And I'd love to give you more information to think about some of the policies and the laws that have led us to this. But I think one of the things that I just want us to talk about is that, for instance, Minnesota, as we look at African Americans in particular, we have one of the lowest rates of high school graduation and educational attainment in the nation. We also have a higher rate of child poverty overall as it impacts communities of color as a whole. We've seen with the global novel pandemic of coronavirus or COVID-19, a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And we see it also related to the criminal justice system, that African Americans are incarcerated at a higher rate and overly having a concentration of people of color in the criminal justice system. So why do I bring up some of the statistics to help frame this inclusive leadership? Is to then beg the question of how do we ensure that we help to create and foster vibrant communities for all, no matter the color of your skin, no matter socioeconomics, wherever you come from, that we can make sure that inclusion is our goal, the sense of welcoming and belonging as a feeling, but more of a manifestation of what we see on the top of the US Supreme Court building, equal justice under the law, making that come alive of equal opportunity, equal access to quality education, to the economy, and so forth. So hence why I asked it, not just what is leadership, but what is inclusive leadership? How do we create that equal justice under the law? And let's also maybe bring it into our preamble of our very own Constitution. What does it mean to be a part of a community? And we declare it then as we the people. How do we build that? So please feel free to add some initial words that describe inclusive leadership for you. Maybe one word that comes to mind, you can add it in the chat. We greatly appreciate hearing your insights of what comes to mind when you think of inclusive leadership. So I'll give you just a moment to maybe add in a few of those words that come to mind for you. Intentional. Thank you, Lee. Gabrielle, responsive. Kindness. representative, humility, safe. All excellent answers. Thank you so much. I appreciate it that you're sharing your insights, and please continue. If there's another word comes to mind, don't hesitate to put it in the chat. So when I think about it conceptually, there's a few things that come to mind. The first thing that was very clear from your responses is that we have to have a vision of what we seek to accomplish. If we're going to say inclusive leadership, we have to have a clear sense then of what is the manifestation of it. What does it feel like is one piece of the puzzle, but also how do you experience it? And when I think about it, I think about even my own family as I started to talk about the Rondo community, the ability to have opportunities to live out the American dream. As entrepreneurs, as lawyers, as leaders in the community, how can you make it come alive? So I have this particular quote from Oprah Winfrey, and I think a part of this is important for vision. It gives us a sense of reassurance of how we can move forward with planting seeds for today, tomorrow, and the future. So Oprah said, whatever our dreams, ideas, or projects, we plant a seed, nurture it, and then reap the fruits of our labor. So it talks about that piece of being intentional, as you had identified as one of the qualities of leadership. And next, this is related to justice, and the theme for today of racial justice in particular. This is from Professor Ibrahim Kendi, and he wrote the book, How to Be Anti-Racist. You may consider adding that throughout the presentation. I'll have a few homework pieces, but you may consider adding that book to your reading list. And he says to be anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. And what he's talking about is, by working definition, his premise of being anti-racist is being proactive in first gaining knowledge about the history of race and racism in America, and also as a global phenomenon as well, because we know race as clearly a social construct. There is no such thing as race. In fact, based upon the research, if you're curious, the reality of it is there's one thing, if we want to use the term race, and I don't mean to get too scientific here, we can talk about the human race, because the reality is no matter who's on the call today, our DNA, if you connect us all together, is over 99.999% the same. Now, we may see different qualities. Of course, you're saying, well, Dr. Tyner, you may have a little extra melanin in your skin. You may have certain features. But the reality of it is the human DNA, the structure of human genes and a genetic makeup make us more similar than we are different. So when we look at Dr. Ibrahim Kendi's work and his work in mobilizing folks to get a deeper understanding of anti-racism, he's talking about a proactive call to action to challenge ourselves to move forward in building that inclusive society and world by taking proactive and intentional steps. So I will conclude with giving us an outline of what those steps can be. Last but not least is from the late Dr. Maya Angelou, and she gives us a sense of service in order to build these type of communities that we all say we want to live in. It's the work, for instance, that you're doing with Thrive, that you're coming together, you're building coalitions, you're creating opportunities to learn and grow together. So collectively, she talks about this sense, if you get, give, if you learn, teach. She's talking about the beauty of what we call today servant leadership, that truly service is the catalyst that leads to the manifestation of leadership coming alive. So then when we think about it, since we're specifically thinking about how to teach children and how to cultivate these types of not just learning opportunities, but a vision for our families and our communities collectively, I think it's important to beg the question then, what are the skills? How do you manifest this? So when we think about the skills of inclusive leadership, here's a diagram that I think can help guide us a bit. It starts with that first piece. And I encourage you to continue to think about this. What is your collective vision? What are the values of your community? As I talked about Rondo, I was quite blessed to know that some of the values of our community are rooted in heritage and culture. For instance, you hear that piece of it takes a village to raise a child. You get a clear notion if you look at some of our educational programs, some of our outreach pieces, that we are interconnected and have been for generations in our community or neighborhood, based upon that common mission and vision on how do we help to raise children that are deeply rooted in their cultural heritage, that embrace differences, but at the same time, with a commitment to that last piece that I talked about, how do we serve in our community? You also have to have a sense of a strategic plan. And when I talk about that, what do you seek to achieve? Now, most of my work is working with maybe corporate partners or large organizations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And oftentimes they say, well, Dr. Tyner, we want to make everyone feel equal. We want everyone to have a chance. We want our workplace to serve our clients in a holistic manner. We want our workplace to reflect the reality of what America is. And I'll actually pause here. When I say what America is, I'm going to talk about it just briefly in demographics alone. Now, for me, I started my work around diversity, equity, inclusion research about 10 to 12 years ago. And I remember I would go out, I'd share the research, what was the change in cultural demographic, and I would rely a lot upon a quote from the late Dr. Maya Angelou. And she talked about that how diversity makes for a rich tapestry, that the threads are basically coming together. No thread is greater than the other because the tapestry is the whole. So I would give examples of a changing national demographic. First, there are two things that you have to know if you're looking ahead to the future. One, of course, there's my other homework assignment. We're past the deadline now, but make sure we have to keep it at the forefront of our minds. The US Census. That way we have clear data about the trends and we know more about our community. But in addition to that, just in case you're not as familiar with the census, this is also about political representation. So the census number determines how many seats that we have in the US House of Representatives. And it also determines something that's critically important as well, the direction of $600 billion plus, so it's over $600 billion of federal resources being allocated to our community. Why am I bringing this up? It's important to know that the landscape is not changing and it's already changed. Where I sit here in my home office in St. Paul, I can tell you that as of today, St. Paul is a majority minority city. So it means that our demographics have rapidly changed. So it means with me sitting in key leadership roles, I have to think about a strategic plan that's inclusive to a changing multicultural landscape. How do I bring together my East African brothers and sisters? How do I bring in looking at change of demographics related to in the Frogtown community, a large Hmong population? How do we bring everyone to the table to make sure that inclusion comes alive? So here it is. If I was in the classroom, I'd make it a pop quiz. So when I started my work, I'd go out and say, America will no longer have a racial or ethnic majority by year. And people would pause and they'd say 2080. And then some who had read the reports would say 2060 because they were looking at the 2010 US Census reports. Fast forward to today, with many of the state data that's been collected and putting it together to piece it together nationally, we know that initially, a few years ago, if you saw me, I would have said 2050. We know today that the year is actually 2043, that in fact, where we sit here in 2020, the vast majority of new births in America are children of color. Also, the vast majority of students in the K through 12 school system across the nation are children of color. So if you think about that, I hope that you see it as an opportunity on how we can think about how do we learn about other cultures, how do we embrace other cultures in strategic ways, and how do we build a community? Because for me, what does that sound like? It sounds like diversity and talent. How do we bring that diversity of talent together to help create sustainable solutions to many of the challenges that our communities face? I also think it's important, and please, if you'd like to learn more about what I'm saying on these pieces on the innovation and the sustainable solutions, please put a question in the chat. I'd be happy to talk about how my work, I've been able to work around the world, helping to bring innovative solutions together for education. And I'd be happy to share some examples. It also will take critical thinking outside the box. Instead of just saying, for instance, I have to challenge myself, not in just in the classroom. Oftentimes I'm thinking about diversity in learning styles. I'm also thinking about diversity in backgrounds. To be able to bring all of these pieces together, it helps me to train a more effective and more relatable and more engaged new cohort of attorneys. If my students are not able to work with clients who don't share their same racial demographic or don't have a background of working, walking, playing across cultures, they're missing an opportunity. And now it's finally been manifested, even in our accreditations for law schools, as a core competency. I see in the future for all professional roles that a piece of what we all will need a greater understanding of is how to work in and around and with and in partnership and uplift and embrace. I'm throwing all these words together for a common theme. How can we work together to help continue to build the future of America? That's also about influence. So I hope that we can model it in the classroom in some effective ways. We can model it in our homes, in our community, in our civic work. How do we use our influence to bring people together? And how do we use our influence related to, and I'll use a little example from Elmo. You're thinking, what does Sesame Street have to do with it? If you haven't seen it yet, there's a new Sesame Street show called The Power of We. And basically what The Power of We focuses on, Elmo learns how to be an upstander, of how to use his influence to challenge racial injustice and inequities directly. And I think that perfectly fits into this piece of modeling the way. How do you model the way to a future of a more equitable and a more just society? What exactly will it take? What will it require each of us? And a piece of it is what we're doing today, coming together, building knowledge, and taking action to help restore and uplift everyone in our communities. So when we think about this specifically, just two quick things I also have on the slide, our leadership. And when I'm talking about leadership, I'm not talking about a position or a title. I'm talking about our ability to be impactful in our communities. And so when I think about that, and based upon the research, we know that it's rooted in our values. What are your values around service, around community, around engagement, around civics? Think about how you're teaching, excuse me, those values to young people, and how are you modeling the way? We always hear the cliche, but maybe a very truthful notion, though, that young people are watching our behaviors and our actions. What are we doing? What do they see when they see us? And then last but not least, we think about DNA, and I talked about our genes and how we all come together. That question of what is your signature leadership style? What is unique about you as an individual is just as important as what's unique in those attributes that you have. So how does this relate to leadership? I think it's critically important for us to think about, for our leadership DNA, what's our leadership story? So a bit of homework for you. I want you to think about, and specifically since we're talking about race, I would be a little more broad in my response here. But a piece of homework that I give to you is, what was your first experience in learning about race? What shaped your understanding of race, of who you are, of the identity of others? And this could be, of course, it could be positive experience. It also could be negative experience. But I think in order to be able to move forward with learning and growth, we have to understand what ideas, what stereotypes, what prejudices, how have they shaped who we are? And I'd love to make it personal, because I think it's very important for us. I know we're coming together as a group, so I'll give a couple personal examples of my own experience in opening my eyes and my willingness and ability to challenge myself as it relates to actively. And that's why Dr. Kinde calls it anti-racist, because it's an active pursuit of challenging all these things that are inside each and every one of us. So I'll give you a personal example. I think my first really aha moment around race was in college. And I'll never forget it because it led to a large protest. It was looking at a particular film in one of our theater arts classes, which is A Birth of a Nation. And we know that A Birth of a Nation, I didn't know it because admittedly, I was working 2 jobs in college, 2 full-time jobs to pay my tuition. I wasn't awake during the film. I'll just tell on myself. I'm amongst friends. So I missed the film. Still haven't seen it to date. But, the rest of the students saw the film. And they challenged the professors on why did they play the film. You could have explained how motion pictures evolved over time, that the film wasn't necessarily the best way to handle the situation without having any context and also offering any support on how to process it. You just don't play A Birth of a Nation and move on. And if you're not familiar with The Birth of a Nation, it has some offensive pieces as it relates to white supremacy, ideology, And when we look at it specifically, of course, it's going to be something that would make folks feel a certain type of way about what they saw in the film. So I remember, as I said, this was my first introduction of race, because my identity, now this is fascinating. This is why leadership stories are important. My first identifiers at my core was not race. That's why I said I didn't have this experience until college. My first identifier, and I encourage you, you can download a copy. Here's another piece of homework to go with this leadership story. You can download something that's called the diversity wheel. And what you'll notice is within that wheel, there are multiple different circles, meaning multiple different layers, whether it's related to gender, socioeconomics, related to education. So my core indicator was not race or ethnicity. It was related to religion. The first indicator that I had was related to my religious background. So I was well versed in, if you ask me, what did the Apostle Paul say to the Philippian church? I could tell you word for word. But if you ask me something as simple as who was the founder of Black History Month, I had no idea that it was Dr. Carter G. Woodson until I was an adult. So I say this because a part of your leadership story is learning what's been at your core. How did it shape your values? How does it inform who you are? Because once we have the opportunity to share those stories and engage in understanding who we are, we also can see things more clearly on areas that might be, and I recommend this book especially as well, it's called Blind Spot. It may help us see some of the unconscious, you hear it now, of the unconscious or implicit biases that impact us. Those are those things that we do not see at the surface. And those are the things, though, however, have a great impact. So although we're saying we are proactive in our efforts, whether it's related to racial equity or racial justice, implicit bias or unconscious bias is still pervasive. And it's something that we still have to each day, each moment, be proactive in challenging. So if you have not taken it, I highly recommend taking the implicit association test. They are provided through Harvard University. They're available on their website and they're free of charge. So consider the fact that I've given you a gift this evening. I give you one challenge though. Make sure you're well prepared to take it, that you have some time. And there's a variety of different categories from race to aging. I'm looking at ability. You can look at a range of different things. But I just challenge you to be honest with yourself, because what you'll see is that the images are moving quickly, split second. And remind yourself that that's the way implicit bias works. It means that in a split second, I have already made a decision about someone. And since we're talking about race tonight, based simply on the color of their skin. So I encourage you to take, it's called IAT, Implicit Association Test. So as we move forward, one of the things I think is a stereotype about young people is that they're too young to make a difference. And they don't have the experience needed, and they don't have a position or a title of authority. But I challenge you to look at a bit of a different way to give you a clear sense of that we have a challenge to redefine leadership. So oftentimes when I'm looking to learn more about the work that I'm doing, I'm reaching out to young people, I'm reaching out to other students, and I'm redefining leadership in the sense of how do we come together to build that collective vision for the future? What does it look like? What are our considerations? And what direction should we be going? So when I think about this specifically, it goes beyond those notions of who is the leader? Who is the leader? How is it documented? How do we know which direction to go? And thank you. Please, I'll make sure we get to all the questions as well. And asking that question of how young people can lead change. So oftentimes we hear that it's a leadership debate of that question of who can lead? How can they lead? Are leaders born or made? So I will help you with what we're doing today as far as having this conversation about community building, engaging yourself and doing some of the homework that I talked about. We can get a sense that leaders can be made in the sense of through our experiences and being intentional in our efforts of leading change. Now, historically, we know that initially, if you think about the canon or the background of leadership studies, which I do currently teach, you get a sense of it started from this idea of the great man theory. And basically, that was a notion that leaders were only a few that were born into leadership based upon their gender, based upon the other piece is the metaphor around military in the sense of that leadership, about community building that was really about war. And I think today we can get some unique insights and know that by being proactive in our approach and moving forward in this piece that we call inclusive leadership and promoting anti-racism is something that we can be made based upon our experience and learning and expanding our frame of reference. So when we look at this specifically, just go to the next slide here, we get a sense then that leadership is a journey and not a destination. And I can tell you, I gave you only one example of my background as it fit into my leadership story, but there are countless examples where I have to be open to learning and growing, admitting my own biases and how they impact me and leading to what are some of those blind spots, those things that I cannot see clearly. How do I challenge them and make sure that I don't allow them to dictate my actions or even inaction? So when we think about this be a superhero, the theme of our conversation tonight, here are a few things that I want you to think about. Some of the qualities that you can help teach young people and help to bring in the classroom and more broadly into the community. It's about being a servant first. I talked about that importance of us all coming together, bringing our gifts and talents to bear to make sure that we're building the type of community and the type of society to be a gift to future generations. Another piece is empathetic listening. It's critically important. You don't have to look too far. You can get on your Facebook account or even watch the news. And you're seeing people, they may be hearing other folks, but the question of whether or not they are listening is a different proposition. And to add that adjective of being empathetic, it means I'm not listening just to gain more knowledge. I'm not listening and just looking in this direction to see each of you just to say that I was a part of the community tonight. When I engage in empathetic listening, I'm bringing my heart and my mind together to say that I'm listening in a way, in a different way, to help to build common understanding, help to build unity, and help to dispel some of the myths and barriers that we may have about each other. I also recognize then as a superhero for justice, we're going to be a team player. This is about the whole. This is about the big we, not the me or the I. How do we build a team, whether it's at our workplaces, neighborhood, classroom, wherever you are? How do you engage in effective team building? This piece I talked about already. What are some of the strategies to address some of the problems that our communities are facing? This other piece is once again about using your influence. How do you help inspire others to serve? And then how do you also demonstrate some of these values of integrity, respect, and humility? And you may be wondering, what is the picture all about? How does this relate to this particular slide? This is actually my grandmother, and she and I are the main characters of my book, Justice Makes a Difference. I decided to, as I thought about anti-racist curriculum for children, thinking about multicultural community building, and more importantly, that overarching theme of thinking about leadership development, I had to start to think about, to visualize who inspired me, who inspired my work in the community, who inspired me to think that, first of all, that being a servant is most important and paramount. It was my grandmother. So my late grandma Nellie was really an inspiration, and that picture is adapted from my Citizen of the Week picture. I was determined to be that great servant and be a good citizen in the classroom and outside of the classroom. So I use this as a story to encourage young people, because we know that role models are important, that my grandmother was my role model. So one learning activity that teachers can use and even parents can use, who are your role models related to leadership? Who are the role models that inspire you to think about how you can make an impact in your community? So that's a great conversation starter of bringing our young people together and asking that critical question. You might learn some great information. So I'm just going to share about a few of the superheroes for justice that are featured in our children's book, but more importantly, inspire my work as an educator and that I share with my students on a routine basis as well. And why is this important? Before I introduce you to Ida B. Wells, Ella Baker, all these great heroes and sheroes, because I think if we are really going to address how we deal with race, how we build a sense of community, we have to know something about each other's histories, about our backgrounds. And for me, once again, I didn't learn about any of these names until I was adult. which is a shame because they're not a part of just Black History Month. I have to remind folks. They often say, well, Dr. Tyner, can you come here, they are everywhere during the month of February. And I have to remind them my work is equally relevant 365. And they go, why would you say that? It's like, because this work is about American history. And if we want to build a strong America, we have to know about the pioneering heroes and sheroes who have made those ideals around democracy, around representativeness, around we the people, around a better society come alive. So I'm just going to introduce a few of them to you, and I hope it's really a catalyst. Once again, I go into schools and I help to do superhero projects, and the students get to learn and get to share information cross-culturally, across backgrounds, across geography, about some of the superheroes for justice who have influenced many of them to become who they are today. So the first one is Ida B. Wells. And the reason why I bring up Ida B. Wells and how I teach young people about Ida B. Wells is that she was a very strong anti-racist or inclusive leader. It was more than just words to her, it was a way of life. She said the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And you may be curious, if you don't know Ida B. Wells, how did she do that? She did that through, and I'll bring a pen and a paper, especially for talking to young people. She was a journalist. So she put pen to paper, to typewriter, to be able to tell a critical story about American history. And I'm actually going to pause here. And her book was called The Red Record. The Red Record documented lynching in America because she wanted to tell the story of some of her friends who were lynched in the South. She was originally, her work primarily was in Memphis, Tennessee. So if you make it to Memphis, if you go and you love the blues, I do. So it's one of the places that I visit often. She wrote The Red Record after a few of her friends were killed for this audacious thing. Now, the myth would be, based upon lynching, that it was maybe they glanced in the direction of a white woman, or maybe they even dared to go to the ballot box to vote, or maybe they challenged a white person in public. Oh my goodness. All of those things potentially, and she writes about it in the book, were things that people would say had led to lynching to try to justify it. But her friends were daring enough. They weren't criminals. They didn't commit a crime against anyone. Her friends that were murdered, they were murdered for simply daring to create the American dream, for becoming entrepreneurs, for creating a business, a Black-owned business that was in direct competition with a white-owned business. So when you think of The Red Record, once again, homework, highly recommended, because I don't think that we can ignore that piece of American history. Because as we think about even the work of the NAACP, we talk about Rosa Parks, but Rosa Parks was really into a more significant role than what we know her for. And it's not I'm not mitigating the Montgomery bus boycott, because I think that's monumental. To see a boycott that lasts over a year long and be organized at its magnitude, I think we have a lot to learn about discipline and how to organize social movements. So I'm not negating the Montgomery bus boycott, but Rosa Parks was well known throughout her lifetime as an NAACP investigator. So she spent her time investigating whether it was lynchings or crimes that were happening against African Americans in meaningful ways to shed light on these issues. Hence why the quote from Ida B. Wells, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. So how do I use this in the classroom? I use it to inspire some of my students that are strong and creative writers. I encourage them to write poetry. I encourage them to write about what they see, because I use Ida B. Wells as an example that today you can read The Red Record. You can read that as a documentation to help understand clearly the ways in which we still have more work to do, but the ways in which during her generation, there was plenty of work happening in strategic ways to advance racial justice. Next, I'll introduce you to Paul Robeson. The reason why I bring up Paul Robeson, and I introduced him as a part of my Superhero for Justice Hall of Fame, is because Paul Robeson was very active in using all of his talents. You can see here, he was a lawyer, he was an author, he was an actor, singer, athlete, he was a modern day Renaissance man. In fact, during his time, he was one of the wealthiest men Notice I didn't say black man. He was one of the wealthiest men of his time. And what he talks about is the answer to injustice is not to silence the critic, but to end the injustice. And the injustices that he was really trying to end was related to the racial hierarchy, the racial injustices experienced in America, but also the injustices experienced across the world. And when he worked on issues across the world, he was focusing on looking at labor rights as human rights in some meaningful ways. So when we think about Paul Robeson, I also give this example to my students, is that if we're going to fight for racial justice and racial equity, it will take determination, and it also will take some courage. Because if you know anything about Paul Robeson, the interesting piece about his story, he's almost written out of history, because it happened to be when he was doing his advocacy, it was during McCarthyism. So you can draw the conclusion, if you know anything from history, that Paul Robeson, his passport was banned. And remember, I said he sang all over the world. He sang in dozens of different languages. So all of a sudden, he didn't have access to what? Not only his living, but really his inspiration to be able to use his voice. He talks about lifting his voice and singing for the rights of the people. So when you think about this, I hope that this is an introduction to get a sense of, oftentimes we say, well, racial justice in America just happened. It evolved over time. But the challenge that I give you is I give each of these profiles to know that it took everyday people like yourself to use their voices, to use their gifts and talents to take a stand. I'll lean into that Elmo example again, to be an upstander for justice, to stand up against injustice. So here's just a few more. We have Dr. Wangari Maathai. Now, she represents the global nature of this movement, the global nature of racial justice and racial equity. We know that Dr. Wangari Maathai was from Kenya. She was a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. She helped to create the Green Belt movement. So she helped to bring another dimension into the civil rights, human rights advocacy. She also brought in the dimension of environmental justice. She was concerned about the types of communities that we live in, that we'd have access to clean air, have access to the outdoors. She was worried that with deforestation and losing much of the spaces, and we know this is modern day challenges, let's put it in contemporary times. We look ahead and we say, oh, that was Flint, Michigan with the lead in the water. We know that that's a widespread issue, whether it's lead in water, lead in homes, that disproportionately impact poor communities of color across the nation. We know that in many communities, whether we look at the issue of food deserts, we have more access to a wide variety of fast food and other unhealthy options, and only a slim number of maybe healthy options of organic foods, of things that come naturally from the ground. Why do I bring this up? Because Dr. Wangari Maathai was trying to connect people back to the cycle of nature in some meaningful ways. And what makes her story so monumental, she wanted to do her part by planting trees. She was able to start with just one tree. And if we fast forward to today, the Green Belt movement has planted over 50 million trees across the world. How does this relate to the quest for racial justice and the call to leadership? It gives us a sense of, let's look at her quote. Until you dig a hole, you plant a tree, you water it to make it survive, you haven't done a thing, you're just talking. So let's put it in context of what we're talking about today. Until you take action and challenge bias, stereotypes, challenge unjust laws. It's not planting a tree that we're talking about today, but it's really about planting justice. If we're not proactive in our pursuit of tearing down some of these barriers that I've talked about today, we're really just talking. If we're not proactive at understanding our own leadership stories and how we model it for young people and helping young people understand our youth, giving them the capacity to learn about how to challenge bias, about stereotypes, how to stand up for justice. We're just talking. So she really gives us kind of that action-oriented push on how do we put all these pieces together to be able to be impactful. So when we look at this specifically, the next person that I have, and this is a legacy if we think about maybe the political scene, this is Shirley Chisholm. We know that in 1972, and I think this is an important piece because I've shared about my heroes and sheroes with thousands of people. Most folks don't know Shirley Chisholm's name, and that's quite unfortunate because she helped to open doors for all women in politics. And she helped to open the doors for people of color in some meaningful ways. But more importantly, remember my 365 example? I think she opened the gateway of opportunity really for all of us to see our full potential shine. So in 1972, she dared to be what she said, unbought and unbossed, by running for the nation's highest office, a president of the United States. So she's helped to shape the course of history for young girls, for people of color, all across the nation. A bit of an inspiration to get a sense of you can be impactful and you can make a difference. So this quote is, don't listen to those who say you can't. Listen to the voice inside that says I can. So once again, you may be saying, how can I use this as an exercise for engaging my children, engage my grandchildren or my students? We know based upon research that if and when young people see representation that one mirrors them, that helps to increase a connection to the content and also to learning. That's the idea of mirrors and windows. So windows then is for the broader. This is for the other piece, because you can't say, oh, it's just about children of color, those mirrors. And we know based upon research, representation matters. But we also know those windows are important then for white students as well. What do those windows do? It allows you to see, and I have a window behind me, so I can see my neighbor's house out of this window. So it allows me to see into the experience of someone else and be able to share vice versa, no matter my color. What are those ways that we can engage with mirrors and windows? So what I'm doing now is modeling how to do this, how to share those critical leadership stories from history, from contemporary times, to get a sense of how to create those mirrors for students. Because let me talk about my personal story again. I can count the number of teachers of color that I've had. I don't even need fully two hands. So when I think about representation matters, I'm not saying all my teachers had to be teachers of color. What I'm saying is that a part of what could enhance and could have brought more into my experience if I had that potential. And in fact, when I asked many folks, I've just been doing this study as kind of anecdotal piece initially. One key thing, because we know the numbers are quite small, minuscule almost, of the number of Black men teachers. So then when I beg that question, have you ever had a Black male teacher? The resounding answer is no. So I bring this up because once again, if we want to build those mirrors and windows, we want to make sure that we have representativeness in what we're doing. Hence Shirley Chisholm's determination to be represented both as a woman and both as a woman of color, to add them two together. Next, I'll tell you about Charles Hamilton Houston. There's one more person I'll tell you about, but I just couldn't do a presentation without telling you about Charles Hamilton Houston. Because without Charles Hamilton Houston, we wouldn't be on this call today. We wouldn't be talking about Thrive or anything else, because we would still be living in a segregated America. Charles Hamilton Houston was the mentor of who we know today as Justice Thurgood Marshall. But he wasn't just the mentor of Justice Thurgood Marshall. There were countless other attorneys that he helped to train because he was a professor at Howard University Law School. So he talked about this sense that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. I was like, ouch, I don't want to be on that latter category. But I think we can say it more broadly and say a leader is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. And what was he talking about being a social engineer? You can see the quote here. He was talking about being a mouthpiece for the weak. I don't know about you, there are a lot of issues that we could be a mouthpiece for right now, whether it's homelessness, whether it's related to educational challenges, whether it's related to income disparities, unemployment. There are a lot of things that we can be a mouthpiece for, to be able to talk about the realities and be able to be that sentinel guarding against wrong. Is really about how do we take action in meaningful ways. So Charles Hamilton Houston, and here's a little bit of encouragement for you to think about the importance of this being a collective endeavor on building the type of community that you want for the future. So he was able to mentor the likes of Spotwood Robinson, Oliver Hill, a lot of the great federal jurists that we know today in our history books. And of course, like I said, Justice Thurgood Marshall. But what he was able to do, and what I deeply admire about his work and serves as inspiration for me day by day, is that he was able to lay the foundation for the case that we know today as Brown versus Board of Education. And although he did not live to see it, he helped to ensure that others, and maybe this is a challenge for us all, that we may not achieve all of the goals that we have set forth about racial equity or inclusion or building strong communities today, but he was dedicated to tomorrow and set a firm foundation. In fact, that's my inspiration. That's why I became a law professor, as I learned more about Charles Hamilton Houston. I have a whole shelf in my office dedicated to his work, of all the books about him. And when I think about this specifically, the question then becomes, how will you be that social engineer? What are the meaningful ways you can make an impact? Last but not least, in my superhero Hall of Fame, I have Ella Baker. And I'm pleased to introduce to you Ella Baker, because we're talking about young people, we're talking about our families, we're talking about community. Ella Baker was known in Swahili as Fundi, because they called her that because it meant that she was a master teacher. She was training the future apprentice of the world. Through her apprenticeship, what they were really learning was how to get organized, how to fight against racial injustice, how to do those sit-ins, those boycotts. Ella Baker was helping people get organized in meaningful ways. And when we think about this, just put this in context, I sometimes forget this. It wasn't just about sit-ins at lunch counters. It was really about integrating and bringing people together in all public spaces. So one of my mentors talks about when he grew up in Florida, about how he went to the pool, the public pool. He didn't have access to the public pool simply because he was Black. And we want to make this seem like, and this is a part of the history lesson I don't want us to miss. Many of my students struggle with this. They think in their mind that slavery was so long ago, 400 years ago. In fact, I think the best premise to understand it is that modern day slavery, as we call the transatlantic slave trade, lasted 400 years. But the reason why I'm bringing up my mentor, he is still alive and well and had to go through the process of integrating all aspects of public life in his small town in Florida. So put this in context for you, a little food for thought. That means even for my own family, when you say slavery lasted 400 years, you get a sense then that I'm only 3 generations from slavery. And I know for some folks, it's kind of sobering to think that through, because they think we've come so far in racial justice and racial equity. And I beg the question, have we? In some ways, of course, yes. But have we, I think, is a question that you have to grapple with to understand where you fit into your leadership role. So I know where I fit, because I know based upon laws and policies, I have plenty of work to do for the rest of my lifetime. In fact, I had a colleague say, well, I don't believe structural racism exists. We all have to work hard and want success. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but I will tell you, my response is not about my opinion. My response is based upon my day-to-day life. So I made sure that I reminded my colleague, if there was not structural racism, I would have been unemployed 20 years ago. And why do I say that? Because my day-to-day work is around undoing some of the laws and policies that still negatively impact people simply because of the color of their skin. If you don't believe me and you say, Dr. Tyner, you're going too far, I encourage you to do some homework. I'll give you some local homework. Look at the 1993 Race Bias Task Force report that was conducted by the Minnesota Supreme Court. You will see from a police encounter, it was looking at criminal justice reform, from a police encounter all the way to sentencing and future incarceration. So looking at the entire pathway of the criminal justice system. African Americans in particular are disproportionately impacted. And notice I didn't say disparate just based upon the numbers. I said disproportionately to acknowledge the systemic nature of this. And you still may say, well, Dr. Tyner, come on. Based upon the data I've seen, or even, for data, people are maybe talking about the news, they may be talking about their own biases and their own stereotypes. But let's challenge it head on, since we're talking about race and we're talking about the future. Most people tell me, well, Dr. Tyner, of course there's more contact with the criminal justice system for African Americans. They typically tell me for a few different reasons. And say, well, because African Americans have a higher drug use. False, has been proven false time and time again. They'll say, well, hold on, African Americans commit more violent crimes. False. They'll then say, well, Dr. Tyner, don't you know about black on black crime? I don't even want to answer that because they can go to the Department of Justice or Bureau of Prisons. This is not Dr. Tyner talking, and we know that's a misnomer. Crime is by what? Proximity. So if we want to subscribe, which I'm open to it, if we think black on black crime is an appropriate term, which of course is value laden and filled with biases, oh please, let's entertain it. Let's go on white crime, Asian on Asian crime, and let's report it all. I was looking at a news report on this of how media disproportionately covers when there is a person of color as the crime suspect, etc. So this idea that there's black on black crime is false as well. And there is not a higher rate of crime in our community. And some get really bold. And I guess I just make people comfortable. And so they tell me what's on their heart. And I remember watching a news broadcast and some folks started to ask me about it. And they said, well, it's because it's a part of your genetic makeup. I said, interesting. So they were trying to help me see a premise that there was a such thing as a hoodlum gene, which I thought was very fascinating. I love to hear different things. That's a part of my role as a researcher, to understand and hear and learn more. Once again, that's false. Why am I stopping and pausing like this? Because if I think about the legacy and the work of Ella Baker, she used the opportunities for teachable moments like what I just did to dispel myths and help to find common ground. So once again, I highly recommend that 1993 Race Bias Task Force report, because once again, what's very interesting about it is we did a follow-up for 20 years later in partnership with the Justice Allen C. Page Education Foundation as an educational tool. And what did we find? The numbers are either the same or worse in nearly every category. So it shows, despite even our goodwill and good intentions, unless we're challenging these biases head on and in a meaningful way consistently, we're actually not moving forward in addressing some of the injustices that we know that exist. So in the last couple moments, I'll just give you just a couple things to think about. I'll go through these relatively fast. The rest were really about laying the foundation. But here's what I want you to think about. I know I talked about inclusive leadership. I think another way to maybe talk about it more comprehensively is about cultural intelligence, of how do we teach these tools to young people, about being self-aware. And I think a big piece of this, as you can hear everything that I'm saying, I'm challenging biases and stereotypes through research and data in meaningful ways so we can help see each other more clearly. Next, of course, this is why I spent the bulk of the presentation focusing on knowledge. If we know that research shows us of the positive affirmations that come from mirrors and windows, how do we make knowledge about our racial history become a part of our curriculum, become a part of our family conversations and our community dialogues? And then the other piece is the behavioral capability. In order to do any of the things that I said today, you have to have an open and willingness to learn, an open and willingness to challenge your own stereotype bias and biases, to challenge the prejudices that you may have accepted just because someone said that's how a group is, how they are, they're all grouped together. And one last piece for this, a behavioral capability, is to make sure that we even combine it with knowledge. So for instance, as I talked about race being a social construct, is there more that you can do to think about how we can address the issues as they relate to race and racism, but at the same time have a process that's evolving, that we have a clearer sense of understanding and appreciating cultures and ethnicities? How do we bring that into the conversation as well? To appreciate my cultural background, my roots, how do I bring those together in a collective way to help engage in community building? One of the ways that I use this is a teaching exercise that came from Michelle Norris. I use this in the classroom as a part of that leadership story. I have my students write down the 6 I am statements. Who are you? It's very clear from my presentation. I've talked about all these, that I'm a person of faith. I told you that's at the center and the core of my diversity wheel, that I'm from Rondo. I gave that as my introduction, that I'm an educator, I'm a writer, I'm about civil rights as a civil rights attorney, and committed to and I am an internationally recognized leadership scholar. So how do we bring this as a lens around how do we lead and manifest change in meaningful ways? So last but not least, this is what I'll leave you with, is some of the activities that you can engage in with young people around being proactive in these challenges around being anti-racist. So first, we've talked about this, but I have to reiterate it because I think it's important. In order for me to be more effective in bringing forth inclusion, bringing forth racial equity, fighting for justice, I had to understand my own story and the values that were behind it, the influence, the attitudes, the behaviors that influenced me. Because I thought, the first thing that I always said, if everyone worked hard enough, they'll be successful. Unfortunately, my research over the years have shown me that that's not quite the case. Because yes, that's an important piece, and my mother's a great chef. It's an important piece of the recipe, but there are other components like equitable hiring practices. I'm working on a project related to pay parity and fairness. How is it still yet today, women's pay is not on par with men? And we have the audacity to write all these things down as studies, and we say it won't take until it will be year blank, and year blank is 2059. Imagine that. We're in 2020. It'll take until 2059 to have pay parity for women. And that's for women as a whole. If we get into the nuances of intersectionality, let's put on women of color. African-American women have to work. If we want pay parity for 2020, we'll have to work all the way through 2020 into August 2020. For Latinas, they have to work all the way past 2021 into November 2021 for pay equity. Why do I use this as an example? I don't have to wait to 2059 or 2089 to figure that out. We can figure that out right now. So what are the issues that have influenced you, but at the same time, how do you challenge them in some practical ways? The next piece, I think that example I just gave really sums that up. How do we bridge the knowledge gap? I talked about it related to gender equity, but how do we bridge it around this thing called race? It's the elephant in the room. It's a thing that we don't want to talk about, but it feels like it's always present. But we have to understand the idea that race is a part of, and it surrounds us. If we look at the research about race, bias, stereotypes, and prejudices, it's like the air we breathe, it's surrounding us. But the question is, how do we change? Maybe it's that Dr. Wangari piece. How do we change and purify the air? And I think we purify the air by changing laws and policies and our actions and inactions to make sure we are thinking about that notion of how do we make racial equity come alive. And last but not least, I know you'll have a recording, but how do you share these lessons? How do you have a conversation about this and build a family action plan, build a school action plan, build a community action plan of what does racial equity look like? And then build out the benchmarks around it. What will we do year one? What will success look like? What will we do year 5? What success look like? I train companies and corporate executives all day long. And the reality of it is, I cannot believe that they can tell me everything about their product and their service and everything they're seeking to achieve. And you ask them, what are your efforts about racial equity? And no one knows. Now, you can either look at it in one of two ways. You can look at it as a moral case. Companies have given millions of dollars to address racial equity, especially following the murder of George Floyd. Or you can look at it, this is a both and. That's a moral imperative of saying, how do we make racial equity come alive in some meaningful ways? But the both and is also the business imperative. The reality of it is, as you look at the research by 2025, the mega cities with a global GDP, I have to tell you, my friends, I'm not an economist, but I love reading all the research. They're not here in the United States. So if I'm thinking about a business imperative, it must be global, it must be comprehensive. And I can't do that if I don't have racial equity and inclusion at the forefront of what I'm doing. So that's tapping into talent, both for employees, tapping into my customer base, making my work sustainable. But you can even see it based upon the research that was submitted as a part of some of the cases before the Supreme Court on these topics is what? That we know consistently diversity and inclusion equals innovation equals increased productivity. And we also know, based upon the research, that it can be quantified now and looking at the economic benefit of including and cultivating all talent. Here's my last slide. I alluded to it. This is my Sesame Street slide. This is the chant from the short video that they had. And I think it gives us a sense of the broader message that I will conclude with. That there are some practical ways if we're going to challenge racial inequities, racial injustice, and make this part of being anti-racist a proactive approach of learning, growing, and challenging these inequities. I think this piece they have, and I can't quite sing the song, but you can watch it. It's a short 20-minute watch. They say, listen, act, unite. Listen, act, unite. So it's that empathetic listening. Listening not just with your mind, but also with your heart. Hearing the stories of others. Looking at through windows to be able to see more clearly their experience. Acting is challenging the inequities at the root, at its core. And uniting is really the philosophy of what we hope to take from it all. How do we come together in meaningful ways? Because it's that thing, we hear about it in the African proverb that a bundle of sticks is stronger than one. So how do we build that sense of unity in the community? That bundle of sticks is a culmination of our talents, our gifts, our cultural backgrounds. And it's something that we embrace. It's something that we don't ignore. It's something that we don't run from. And it's something that brings us together for just one simple piece. That's my mantra of living for our shared destiny and common humanity. So thank you. I look forward to hearing some of the questions and engaging more.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, you can put those in the chat and we'll address them from there. I'll start with a question, Dr. Tyner. I'm not going to type it in the chat. So I noticed that your one of your last slides here talked about starting with examining your own story, looking at your own influences, attitudes, behaviors, which obviously includes analyzing your own biases. In my experience talking about that, I teach high school, so I don't work with little kids, but talking with about that with high school students and adults makes people really uncomfortable because people want to say, well, I don't have any biases. I am a totally unbiased person. I love everybody. I'm really open and accepting. So what advice do you have on helping people understand that having biases is human and it's important to look at them?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. For me personally, I was that person. When I first started reading about implicit bias and the challenges around it, I stopped reading the studies. See, I said I'm telling on myself, right? So I thought this isn't for me. And I'll tell you why. I said, first, it doesn't align with my religious values. I have to love people the same way Christ loved people. I don't have any bias, not for me. Second, I said, hey, I was a Girl Scout. I'm on my honor. I would try to love, I'm just like serve God, my country, help people at all times, live by the Girl Scout law. And I always threw love in there too in between. So I was like, absolutely not. And then I was like, of course, there's no way I can have bias. I'm one of the most courteous people that you ever met. I think my mother taught me how to iron napkins and took me to etiquette school. By the time I was probably in kindergarten, I was excelling at etiquette. So I thought, this is not for me. I said, that must be for the person over there. So a part of why I was so appreciative and why I'm committed to this work and why I tell my own stories is because I was the biggest opponent of the whole idea. I said, no, thanks. But over time, and I'll tell you when it came alive. It came alive, we did a case study in Hennepin County. And in Hennepin County, one of the things that came up, all the judges, of course, and this is consistent with the research about bias, they said, of course, there's no way there's bias in the legal system. How could there be? Lady Justice, two things about her. First of all, she's blind, meaning she can't see anyone. So she can't see, and when they say that, it means she can't see the people. She's looking for justice. So I'm talking about it as a philosophy, not related to ability, but she can't see any of the parties. She's just seeing it, and her mind is visualizing about law and justice and equality. And then she also has two things in her hand, the scale. So she's weighing justice in some meaningful ways to make sure based upon the facts, and it's going to be rational. It's going to make sense. It's going to be beyond the preponderance of the evidence, all these pieces. So how in the world could there be bias? So I would say that was the eye-opening experience, because one of the judges was open to a study, which I applaud the judge for. I think that took a lot of courage to open yourself up to a study about your final dispositions or actions in cases. Consistently, what this particular judge, what was seen was it was in juvenile court, two defendants, identical cases. Only controlling factor that the researchers looked at was race. Two completely different outcomes. And when I say this, we can think of, and I'll tell you what I was thinking of. Well, maybe it was a parental involvement. Maybe it was this. Maybe it was a cost. Maybe it was who was represented. Once again, identical case studies. I'm a researcher, so I knew based upon the research, this is how deep my bias was. What I was seeing was an accurate study. You have two young people, same scenarios, both represented or both unrepresented. The only thing that changed in the control sample was their race. Every case, a Black child had a harsher sentence. That was my real aha moment, because I knew the judge. And I'm like, that's a nice judge. We all like each other. It wasn't about whether or not we liked each other, or if the person was nice. It wasn't about even what was on paper for the case and what was in front of the judge. It was the bias that impacted who was more criminal than someone else. So I would say how I teach it to my students, and in fact, I was just teaching this topic just 2 weeks ago in my coursework. I teach it through case studies. And I let people draw the conclusion themselves as they think about how could we look at those cases and not say that something else was at play when the cases were identical except for race. And there's countless ones. There was recent ones that came out about legal memos. As soon as you put that a person of color, in particular, the recent case study was an African-American wrote the memo, all of a sudden it's the same memo, just change the name. The white candidate is John, let's say the Black candidate is Jack. How is it that when Jack writes that same memo as a Black man, it's deemed inferior, it's deemed as having too many typographical errors and being incoherent? It's impossible. It was the same memo that the law partners read. So I think a part of it is through example. And if we can't take it in contemporary times, there is enough examples through history to help us to be able to see where some of the challenges are. And then following up with some of the critical questions. I can't think of anyone that's going to wake up and own and say, oh, I was biased and now I see. Like I was blind and now I see. No, I think it has to be related to an experience. And for me, it was a sense of kind of that righteous indignation that even redirected my career to make me go into public interest law and look at these issues more clearly. And I also think it's that bullet point number 2, of bridging the knowledge gap. If we have no knowledge of history, if we have no knowledge, like the average person that I talk to, and I'd love to do a national survey on this, I just have to get some additional funds to do this. But just ask me a simple question. Is Africa a country or a continent? Shocked how many people get it wrong. And then the reality of it is, so I say it's a country, it's a continent with 55 countries. People are like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Well, then you ask them what's their first delineation of an entire continent. And they have no idea, but a bunch of negative stereotypes that they've seen on TV. So I think a part of it is also, where are those opportunities to learn, to be able to challenge the bias at its root? That's why I take students to Africa. I had to tell one student, though, I was like, I should stop cracking jokes, but we were leaving the airport that's larger than the JFK airport in the heart of Accra, Ghana. I told the student, watch out. He was putting his luggage in the trunk of our private car. This should have been an indicator, but of our private car. And I said, watch out, a lion's coming. Oh, he almost jumped and broke his neck. I was like, ooh, this is going to be liability. I shouldn't joke like that. But I said, why would you think a lion is coming? He's like, because the only image that he had was of Lion King and Tarzan, of an entire continent. I was like, when you get out and see this, it was late at night. But I said, when you see this, first of all, if you told someone about a lion, they would laugh. They would say, no, we go to the zoo, we want to see animals. Just like there's not lions running around in St. Paul, Minnesota, or in Hastings where you are. So, but where do these stereotypes come from? And you can keep them and hold on to them, even if they're subconscious as these biases, because it's not challenged with reality. Hence why I write about Africa. I do photo exhibitions about Africa, because when I was growing up, the only image you were shown of Africa is swollen bellies of children and flies on the kids' heads. And I'm just like, I don't understand how that's the only image of 55 countries. And look at how inaccurate it is. So I say this as I give just a summation on it, bridging the knowledge gap of making sure you have access to information and knowledge in meaningful ways to challenge these biases at the roots. I also highly recommend the resources that are available on implicit bias on the Kirwan Institute. It's a part of Ohio State University. Their researchers, this is their main area of study on how to address bias in meaningful ways, and how to also, before you can address it, you have to be aware.
Okay, I'm going to read one of the questions from the chat. She says, I like the Sesame Street video example. What are other examples, maybe language or stories, of how we can help our youngest learners start this journey? So do you have any other titles?
Excellent. And it wasn't just Sesame Street. PBS actually had an example first through the character Arthur. And I love that one because it brought in John Lewis. And it was a reminder even for me. I had to challenge some inequities in hiring practices. And at first I thought, I don't want to always be the person challenging it. But I was thinking about that PBS special. And I was thinking about John Lewis and how to get into good trouble. So PBS has a special as well. You now can, times are changing, which is a good thing to see times. And when I first started, I run my own publishing company and also my own bookstore. When I first started, it was unheard of. And when I say when I first started, it was in 2016, I started planting the seeds on this work in particular. We were met with all types of resistance. When I tried to work with mainstream publishers and bookstores, they would give us a sense, and it was very offensive, that, for instance, African Americans, we don't read, so there's not a customer base. And I thought to myself, first of all, I don't know how offensive or even more offensive you can be, because that, once again, is false. But even if it were true, which it, of course, is not, the reality of it is, if it's mirrors and windows, the books that I'm writing are for the world, for a broad audience. So we ended up, after hearing no too many times, starting our own publishing company, publishing our own books. I give this as an example because there's a whole movement around we need diverse books. So there are resources available. If you just follow that hashtag, we need diverse books, and own voices that's coming from authors of color writing their own stories, you will find a wealth of different resources. On a personal level, you're welcome to go to my YouTube channel. I'm talking about these topics all the time. There's free virtual reads, free resources. So I would say where we sit today, here in October 2020, there are plenty of resources available online. The other resources that I appreciate are through the Smithsonian. There are a number of interactive resources around combating anti-racism. And I'm giving you things that have age appropriate. So for the younger children, for high school age, even for adults. So there are, at where we sit today, which is really a blessing, there are more resources available than I could have even imagined 5 years ago.
Okay, another question in the chat is, I understand that we need to begin with ourselves. How do we begin or continue to expand the effort into the broader community?
Excellent question. In fact, I'm currently developing a curriculum for this. Is related to civic engagement 365. I think once you get that understanding and you're rooted in, of course, yourself, your own leadership story, that's great. But of course, the next step is, how do you take this to capacity? Now, for me, I think an important piece of it is prioritizing a few issues that you're passionate about. I know right now everyone's busy. All my friends are like busy, busy, busy. Busy is their default. They're trying to make sure everybody gets the ballot box. I understand, but I keep challenging them and I say, what happens after they go to the ballot box? This is a 365 endeavor. Most years you have at least one election related to primaries, but we have, a national election in the sense of thinking about the future of the nation at the highest pinnacle. And I'm not talking partisanship here. I'm just talking in general, and everything you see, I'm getting text messages, phone calls all night long. Everyone's saying vote, vote, vote. But my challenge for us is to think about what are the core issues after we've voted. What are the core issues that are important that we'll commit time to? So for me, there are plenty of issues. And I used to think the sea is so wide, my boat is so small, you get overwhelmed. I encourage you to think about 2 to 3 issues that you want to impact. So for me, I'm very active on 2 pieces: criminal justice and education reform. So that means I went beyond, and I'm still working through it each and every day. You don't end this piece of understanding your own leadership story, but then you start to evolve and say, how does that lead to a sense of agency on bringing forth change? So that means yours truly. I get involved locally, school board issues. I get involved in what's happening in administrative agencies. I encourage you, you can go to the Secretary of State website, apply for an appointment from Governor Walz. One of the things that's how I became so well versed in pay parity issues, because Governor Dayton appointed me to the Young Women's Initiative. So get involved in some meaningful ways. And why did I say 2 or 3 issues? It's tempting. Once your passion for social justice and social change is ignited, you want to do everything. But I would challenge you to be intentional on thinking about how you can be impactful in your community. And there are plenty of ways, whether it's, like I said, serving on a local board or commission, whether it's writing a letter into your elected officials, offering resources for your local schools, finding some ways to serve and get involved, to take action. Because remember, I said it was listen, act, unite. How do you take action in your community in some meaningful ways? And it could be as simple as, truly, my friends, maybe you're the person that just asked some questions. You go to the county commissioners meeting, you go to the city council meeting, and you ask some questions. And here's one simple question that you can ask wherever you are. How does this plan advance racial equity? And once I think we all ask that enough, I think that's when we'll start seeing change manifested. I don't think it's asked at all in most instances, and not often enough to make racial justice really come alive.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. It's a long one, but it says, in your work, have you seen examples of organizations and or communities who have done this work and seen some success? Can you talk about the need for leadership within organizations? Is that necessary to make organizational and systemic change? She's asking this because Hastings has had a lot of key leadership changes in the last couple of years.
Okay, so I'll start with the last question. A lot of leadership changes. Do you need organizations to bring forth change? I think it helps to have some of the same leaders, if you can, that you can work with, and there's been, longevity in the process, but I don't necessarily think it's a requirement. I think what's a requirement, and maybe I can sum up my response to this entire question, of both questions. When I first started doing legislative advocacy, because I wanted to do large-scale systems change, radically transforming laws and policies around criminal justice and education, I ended up with a remarkable mentor. He was, and here's an organization to your first question that you may want to follow. It was the NAACP and our local St. Paul branch. So our president was Mr. Nathaniel Kalik. And one of the things that Mr. Nathaniel Kalik told me, because I was devastated. I was like, did we go to the legislature just to fight? At what point, literally, every time I went to talk about issues impacting children, it's like, well, where are the parents? I was like, that helps, but I honestly don't know. Finally, I had to do like a Time to Kill Matthew McConaughey moment. I was just like, there's a child going across the street and there's a semi coming, close your eyes. What do you do? It's a Black child. You had to bring in race because that's what we were talking about. And then finally, we had a breakthrough. No one cared what color the child was or where their parents were. They wanted to save the child. And so no longer did they yell in my face, where are the parents? All of a sudden, we could have a real conversation. But Mr. Nathaniel Kalik taught me an important lesson. He said, remember, you don't have permanent enemies. You don't have permanent friends. You have permanent interest. And as I learned that lesson, it stayed with me a lifetime. And what I learned, what the importance was, not to worry so much about who were the actors or the players. I've been around long enough that I had to reach across whatever aisle we talk about politically. I've had to work with everyone to bring forth racial equity for everyone. I couldn't say it's only this party that will help me. This party won't. This individual will. This would. It wasn't. It will never be that simple, my friends. So as I move forward with permanent interests, it means that I have to have clarity on what my goals are and what achieving my goals looks like. And then from there, I build a process. That way, of course, the leaders have changed since I was in my early days when I was younger. And they've changed. I'm trying to, I'm thinking aloud. Many of them have changed. They've retired, they haven't been reelected, changed county leadership, changed city leadership. Yes. But the one thing that hasn't changed is a constant, those permanent interests that I have. So here's an opportunity for all of you on the call. Take an opportunity to meet those new leaders and articulate what those common interests are. And I encourage you, a simple way, and this is what I'm working on locally in our own community, think about kind of, maybe it's a 10-point plan. Education, jobs, healthcare, libraries. What are those things that consistently that you're looking to make sure are a vital part of the community, and get everybody some main talking points, and let that one be, how does this, what ways will it advance racial equity in a meaningful way? So you need a strategy behind it. But please, I understand, I empathize. I have at times had, inroads with leader XYZ, and then leader XYZ is no longer there. And then I feel like I have to recalibrate and build new relationships with new leaders and wonder if the organizational structure is working and all types of things. But I just challenge you to think about keeping those permanent interests in the forefront and building key coalitions both inside and outside organizations and structures. You need both. An organizational structure that includes only formally where systems of power are supposed to be or should be is an incomplete plan. If you look at the examples that I gave of Ellen Baker and all those heroes and sheroes, they didn't have a formal organization. They had a permanent interest around justice, freedom, and liberty for all, and helped to mobilize others in pursuit of those goals.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Tyner. I'm going to
Thank
put
you.
one thing up here on the screen just to show everybody what we have coming up next for Thrive. Next month, November 19th on Thrive Thursday at 6:30, we will have another presentation, this time with Professor Duchess Harris, who's going to talk to us about race and policing in the age of Black Lives Matter. And then in December on our Thrive Thursday, which is December 17th, we're going to have another presentation, this time with Jay Drake Hamilton, who's Fresh Energy Science Policy Director, and she's going to talk to us about climate and equity. So you can find these on our website and on Facebook, and the Zoom links will be posted there again as well. Thanks, everybody.